everybody. My name's Rachel, and today we're going to talk about sex. Okay, I thought everyone would like giggle, like this is middle school, it's fine. It's fine, I don't need it. Let's break down what I meant by that. So, at my time at Gallatin, I've been studying something called the evolution of female sexual narratives. But what are sexual narratives, and what is this that I've been spending the last 4 years talking about? And how does that connect to rational creatures? We're going to discuss that today. So, this concept of sexual narratives. What does the word sexual mean? It's something intimate, psychological, and physical involving our bodies and, of course, involving sex. And what's a narrative? It's a plot or a storyline. So what's a sexual narrative? It's a plot or a story that somehow involves sexual elements. And I also want to bring up women in here because, as I said, I studied female sexual narratives. And as we move through a timeline of history, we'll see that that wasn't a very inclusive definition of women. But as we move into today, we will be discussing more intersectionality. Most people don't think that women's narratives really came into fruition until the first wave feminist movement, and those people would be wrong. As early as the 18th century, there were a lot of women that were working to expand what it meant to have your gender be part of your writing work. One of these great groups of colleagues and friends were the fair triumvirate of wit, which included Eliza Haywood, Delabreve Manley, and Aphra Behn. We're going to talk about Eliza Haywood. In her book, Love in Excess, she discussed the idea of the fallen woman character, which was usually a negative concept in society. But instead of that, she turned it on its head. A woman who had had an abortion in her society, instead of being looked at as somebody negative, she decided to get remarried and really made the best of the situation and had a positive life after this, which most people thought was not something that was possible. Now, why do I have Jane Austen behind me? She's not very sexy, is she? But what's more of a turn-on than the witty banter in Pride and Prejudice between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy? I'll tell you, 1817 with the publication of the book Persuasion. Now, in that book, we have Anne and Captain Wentworth, and they sit on a love seat together, and their hands touch. Oh my God. And then when she's getting into the carriage, their hands touch again when he's leading her in there. I know this sounds kind of ridiculous to say that that's something sexy, but at the time it really was. People weren't allowed to write like that. So working within her limited frame, Jane Austen really pushed those boundaries. She also created a feminist character in Anne that I absolutely love. At a dinner party, Anne says this quote behind me to a man who thinks that he can't talk to a woman like he would talk to a man. I hate to hear you talk about all women as if they were fine ladies instead of rational creatures. You get it now? None of us want to live in calm waters all our lives. On this side of the pond, there were also female writers who were exploring this topic of what women could write about. One of them is Kate Chopin. She was a Southern Gothic writer who was also a Catholic woman, but in her short story, Desiree's Baby, she explored a mixed-race child and a mixed-race marriage and how that was being interpreted in post-Civil War culture in America. Now, we've finally gotten to the first wave feminist movement in the late 19th century and early 20th century, but all the writers we've been talking about came before that. The first wave feminist movement, particularly in America, was about trying to get the vote out for women and them having more legal rights. At this time, Freud was also conducting research for his book, Theory of Sexuality, where he was examining how young boys and young girls explored their sexuality, and he found a problem with girls. He declared that women who could only receive clitoral pleasure to reach orgasm were somehow wrong compared to those who were having penetrative pleasure to reach orgasm. Coincidentally, at the same time, Virginia Woolf publishes her book, Mrs. Dalloway. And in this book, the title character reminisces on having a relationship with her friend Sally Seton and how that was far more pleasurable than any sex she's ever had with her husband. So Virginia Woolf clearly did not care what Freud was studying. She's also attributed with the quote, "Anonymous for most of history was a woman," which implies, as I've been saying, women could not write freely about whatever they wanted to for a long time. The second wave feminist movement began in 1960 and ran until about 1980. And what women were hoping for in this expanded too. It was about rights for women's bodies, including abortion rights, and also about equal play in the workplace. Sounds like topics we're still talking about. During this time, Anais Nin came into popularity, but not through her name. You might have heard of Henry Miller and his book, The Tropic of Cancer. Guess who edited that book and made sure it got published? It was Anais Nin. She was writing stuff that was just as sexy and just as great, but she wasn't getting all of the press for it because she was a woman. She was limited to the erotica section. But what Nin was doing for sexual expression in her work, Maya Angelou was also able to do for greater racial diversity in her work. With the publication of her memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she wrote explicitly about how her stepfather had raped her and how this had affected her entire understanding of sexuality and sexual behavior moving into young adulthood. It was also when people decided to start discussing how sexual narratives weren't explicitly about pleasure or something positive, but it was a more well-rounded experience and talk. The third and fourth wave feminist movements have the same ideology and the same mission, but they're carried out in different ways and therefore have different time period markers. Third wave feminism began in the 1990s and is considered to have ended around 2012. And fourth wave feminism picked up from there and runs through today. The difference is fourth wave feminism relies on online feminism, so it revolves around online communities primarily. Some third wave feminist writers that were really influential were Rebecca Walker, the daughter of the writer Alice Walker, who is often given credit for coining the term third wave feminism. And she wrote about in her memoir being a Jewish, biracial, bisexual woman and how that led to everything she did with her identity as a writer. On the other side of me, we have Malu Kalasa, who is a Jordanian Filipino writer, and also really cool, because she was writing about the Middle East, which most Western people don't think is a very sexual society. But in her book, The Secret Life of Syrian Lingerie, she talks about how young people are going out and buying lingerie before their wedding and talking about sex the same way that we do in the West. Now we're back to fourth wave feminism and the online feminist movement. And what does this mean? Because we're currently living in this time. How does this change how we express our feminist views? One book that was written during this time was Melissa Fubos's memoir about being a dominatrix, which was a community that she discovered online and then decided to take part in as her job. And while she found this very sexually liberating and an interesting part of her, as she is also a bisexual woman who is part Native American, she also had a lot of mental health issues with this job that then carried into her as she grew older and moved out of young adulthood. And on the other side of me, we're referencing a story that was published at the end of 2017 in The New Yorker called Cat Person, which was written by Kristen Rupenheim. The story follows Margot and a man who meet at her job in a movie theater, decide to go on a date, and then have an awkward sexual encounter and the awkward aftermath of a sexual encounter that they don't necessarily understand in the same way. However, the responses to this were all over the board. Some women responded, such as author Dana Schwartz, and said, "I totally relate to this, I've had the same thing, this is a great story." But other writers, especially women of color, like Roxane Gay, said this only speaks to a particular woman's sexual experience or dating experience. And men, as you might assume from the Twitter account, didn't react very well at all. They said that it was crazy, it didn't happen that way, that the woman in the story was to blame. And many of them even said that it was an article. It was published as fiction, and it was never an article. This is all happening in the time that we're talking about the Me2 movement. But you might not know that the Me2 movement is actually a decade old. It was started by Tarana Burke, pictured behind me, 10 years ago, but with the same idea in mind, to raise greater awareness about sexual assault in the workplace and in women's lives. But it came into the mainstream focus with many actresses who were making accusations against Harvey Weinstein for sexual assault in his business. And now, it's the primary conversation that we're having when we talk about sex, or at least it feels that way. And it's instilled a little bit of fear when people are interacting with each other in the workplace or in their personal lives, or just thinking about sex in general. Some of these thoughts about fear have already been happening for other people as they've been doing research. And it's something that I've thought about a lot when I think about the future of sexual narratives. How are young girls thinking about sex? In a 2011 study by the American Association of Women for 7th to 12th graders, boys and girls, they found that 57% of young adults had experienced some sort of sexual discomfort or sexual assault during their lifetimes. And from the numbers, you can see that this mostly affected girls. And it was even worse if a girl was overdeveloped at a young age, or if she was considered to be pretty. But despite this, over 60% of the boys that were surveyed said that they still found that there were times when a girl could be coerced into having sex, and that was okay. Writer Peggy Orenstein continued this research about young girls in her book, Girls and Sex, where she asked questions of 12 to 22-year-old young women about what they'd experienced when they were having sex, or if they were sexually active at all. She found the same stuff. The girls often didn't have any pleasure when having sex, they were forced into it, and then they felt ashamed, bullied, or extremely depressed. And from this, the results were often that girls just weren't getting in relationships. They were focusing on their careers or going to school or doing something else because they were afraid and worried about what would happen if they did engage in sexual activity. A 2015 study done by the CDC reflects this concern. Across the map, you can see men and young women are having less sex than they were in the 1980s. By the age of 19, less than half are sexually active. So we've heard about positive sexual narratives and negative sexual narratives, but what do we make of all of this and why does it matter? To wrap this up, I want to leave you all with a question to think about. What are sexual narratives going to look like in terms of the Me2 movement? What are they going to look like after this movement has been happening for more than a few months as we've seen it now? Are young girls going to be influenced by the positive narratives in their lives and think they can express themselves however they feel because we have a more welcoming, open environment hopefully we're working towards? Or are the negative elements of a fear culture going to influence them more and scare them into not exploring this? And is that healthy? How do we fix this? What do we think about it? And how is it going to affect the way we think about sexual education and sexual writing going into the future? Only time will tell. Thank you.